what's going on, everybody? Thanks for clicking on the video today. We're going to be diving into Mark chapter 2. If you have not been with us, we're going through the Gospel of Mark together. This is, I think, either video 6 or 7 or 8, one of those, I don't know. But we've had a few videos in front of this. And so if you have not watched those videos, I would really encourage you, pause the video right here, or just get out of the video, go back and watch at least the second video in this series, because that's the introduction that really deals a lot with how we're viewing the Gospel of Mark, what we're doing in this, all the resources we're using, and that'll kind of catch you up to speed when I reference some certain things. But we've already done all the way through Mark chapter 1, and last video we talked about the beginning of Mark chapter 2. Here's what we're going to do in this video. We're going to jump ahead. We're going to skip a few sections in Mark chapter 2, and we're going to go to the very end of chapter 2 to set us up for chapter 3. And so we're going to discover a pretty big textual issue here in Mark chapter 2, and different ways people have tried to resolve it over the years, and what could be going on there. But it's ultimately, it seems like a big issue, but I'm going to show you why it's really kind of not a big issue, or as big of an issue as some people want to say it is. But really what's most important here is the story that Mark is trying to tell about Jesus and his encounter with these Pharisees over a Sabbath issue. So that's where we're going for today. I'm Sam, by the way. I'm a pastor. I've been a pastor for 23 years. I'm a student of the Bible. I'm a Bible teacher. My training involves biblical studies, biblical languages, church history, theology, that kind of stuff. I'm so glad that you've jumped on the video here today. Like, subscribe. Would love for you to do that. If you want to become a member, I have that available also. All right, let's jump right in. And I don't have my normal setup going on here today, so I normally use the NRSV updated edition, but I don't have that in front of me right now. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use the NASB 2020 for today. And then we're going to jump all around to a lot of different things. Okay, so there are parallels of Mark chapter 2, verses 23 to 28 in Matthew and in Luke. This story is told in both of those synoptic gospels, and like I said from the very beginning, we've been looking at this through the lens and through the eyes of the synoptic problem and through Markan priority. And so what we're seeing is that Mark, and what we're using as a presupposition, is that Mark was the first gospel author. He was the first one to write a gospel, and then Matthew utilized Mark and probably another source that he had to compile his gospel. And the way I see it, it's different than the two-source theory, is that I think what we see in Luke is we see Luke using Matthew, Mark, and other sources, and he's just compiling as much as he can here. We're going to see that actually play out in our text today. Okay, so Mark chapter 2, starting verse 23 in the NASB 2020, this is what it says. It says, "And it happened that he was passing through the grain fields on the Sabbath." So Jesus is passing through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples began to make their way along while picking the heads of grain. The Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and he and his companions became hungry? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest and ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priests. And he also gave it to those who were with him." Jesus said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." And so that's the end of our section here. So what's going on real quickly in the story is that Jesus' disciples are walking through a grain field, and they're picking the heads of the grain, and they're rubbing it in their hands, and they're eating them. They're very hungry, and it's a Sabbath. And according to the oral traditions, according to the Mishnah and other things, that this is something you're not allowed to do on the Sabbath day. You're not allowed to do this kind of work. And so the Pharisees are watching this going on. And they question Jesus about it. Like, why do you, if you're a rabbi, if you're someone who's a teacher of Torah, why are you allowing your disciples to disobey, not only disobey the Mishnah and the oral law, but to disobey some of the laws in Torah? Why are you allowing them to work on the Sabbath like this? And they're very disturbed by what's happening here. Jesus has, up until this point, a couple different run-ins with Pharisees and scribes. The last video we looked at the healing of the paralytic, and the scribes are questioning because Jesus says your sins are forgiven, and they're questioning him. They're saying, what are you talking about? How are you allowed to do that? Why are you putting yourself basically in the position of God and saying you can forgive sins here on earth? And Jesus deals with that. But this is not the first run-in. There's a couple different run-ins, one in a synagogue, one here, and now has another run-in here. And there's a few times that Jesus has had run-ins with the Pharisees and run-ins with the scribes over things that he's either allowed his disciples to do or that he is actually saying and doing. And so this is one of those. And they're asking, okay, so why are you, if you're a teacher of Torah and you're a rabbi, why are you allowing your disciples to do this? And Jesus says, hey, let's go back and take a look at a story that happened here. And he's going to basically try to help them understand not only a Sabbath law, but all kinds of different, how to approach law in general. And he sends them back to a story that takes place in 1 Samuel chapter 21, before David is actually king. And so, David's kind of on the run. His friends are with him, and they're very hungry. They're trying to find food and whatever. So Jesus points them back to that story. Now, we're not told in the story that it's on the Sabbath day that David does this. But what's fascinating is that David eats the consecrated bread. This is a huge no-no. You don't do this. Okay, this is breaking of Torah, it's breaking of law, it's breaking what God said. This bread is only for this. It's not for public consumption, whatever. But David goes in, and the priest, when he goes in to do this, the priest is shook that David's there. He's like, "Why are you here?" And so we're going to kind of look at that story. But Jesus's point is that if the law, the Torah, if all of this is only there and it doesn't serve man, then what's the point? If this is not going to benefit us, that following Torah needs to be something that benefits humanity at its core. It cannot be something that detracts, and it makes it so much that you like following it makes it worse to live. And that's what Jesus is trying to say here. He's saying, listen, the Son of Man is Lord over the Sabbath. Like, he's saying the Sabbath was made for us. The Torah and all this was made for people to benefit the people, right? The whole point is to live in this God-ordained kind of utopian kind of society kind of a deal. And so he's saying, well, what's the point of following these things if it doesn't benefit the one who's following it? Like, this doesn't make any sense. And the same thing he's trying to say here with the Sabbath law. Like David operated this way because he was in desperate need, and this benefited him in this moment here. And so it's not some kind of wild thing to think that on a Sabbath, if you are in desperate need, reaching out and grabbing heads of grain and crushing them in your hands and eating the grain is somehow, going to be this, dire thing that you did. Like, Jesus is trying to point out the ridiculousness kind of that, saying, look, it was made for us, not the other way around. Like, we're Lord of. He says the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. And this is the second different time that he's used this Son of Man language as it relates to his authority over things. And so he's saying to his disciples, like, I've got authority over this. And he's saying to these Pharisees, I have authority over this. And so I think that's an interesting point that he's making. But let's go back. I want to take a look at the story in 1 Samuel chapter 21, because there's a discrepancy here that some skeptics of Christianity really have pointed out and said, this is a problem. This is a major problem here. Okay, so 1 Samuel 21. David's on the run, right? Saul gets mad at Jonathan for telling David that he's after him, kind of a deal. David goes on the run. It says, then David came to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech came trembling to meet David and said to him, why are you alone and no one with you? David said to Ahimelech the priest, the king has commissioned me with a matter and has said to me, no one is to know anything about the matter on which I am sending you, and with which I have commissioned you, and I have directed the young men to a certain place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever can be found. He's hungry. He's trying to find food, right? The priest answered David and said, there's no ordinary bread on hand, but there is consecrated bread, if only the young men have kept themselves from women. So the law was that you're not just allowed to come in and just take the bread and do whatever you want to with it. So there's certain stipulations that the high priest knows that you have to be able to do in order to eat of this bread. One of them is that you've got to be a priest, right? And so he's like, okay, well, here's the stipulation that I'm going to make in order to make this an okay thing, is that they've had to keep themselves from women. David answered the priest and said to him, be assured, women have been denied to us as previously when I left, and the bodies of the young men were consecrated, though it was an ordinary journey. How much more then will their bodies be consecrated today? So the priest gave him consecrated bread, for there was no bread there except the bread of the presence, which was removed from its place before the Lord, in order to put hot bread in its place in the day it was taken away. All right, so the bread is, the consecrated bread is there, representing the tribes of Israel, before God, and when it's fresh. When it's not fresh anymore, they take it off, and then it's for the priests to eat. And so, like I was saying, that what Ahimelech is doing is he's saying, well, in order for these guys to be able to eat this, I have to make sure that they are at least have the same level of consecration as the priests would. So you have not been with women. Okay, great. You can now join in and eat and partake of this consecrated bread. They really weren't supposed to do it, though. But the priest made a concession because it's David, because it's these guys, and he doesn't know they're on the run. But he's like, okay, I guess this is okay here. And he makes that concession. Now, here's the issue. The issue is not about the story. The issue is about the priest. In 1 Samuel 21, it says to us that the priest's name is Ahimelech. Okay? In Mark says the priest's name is Abiathar. Now, we have an issue here. And the issue is because, and we're not quite sure how this works, but either Abiathar is the father of Ahimelech, or it's the other way around. Maybe Ahimelech is the father of Abiathar. There's not a lot of clarity on that. But we do know that the priest is not Abiathar, yet Mark says it is. In fact, some people have said, well, maybe it's the difference between the fact that Mark knows the Septuagint versus Mark knows, the Masoretic text, or he knows the Hebrew text. Well, let's look at those. Okay, so here's the Hebrew text. I'm not going to read a lot of it, just enough to get us to where we need to go. So it says, Vayavo, David, Nove, El, Ahimelech. Okay, so there it is, Ahimelech. So Vayavi, and came David, Nove to Nob, to El, to Ahimelech. Okay, so there it is, Ahimelech. That's the name, and that's what we see in the Old Testament Hebrew Bible version of this. So maybe it's different in the Septuagint. Well, here's the Septuagint. Okay, it says, Kai erketai David es nomba pros Abimelech. Okay, so Abimelech, in the Greek, when they're translating from Hebrew to Greek, there's not the sound, and so to put a kai there would be Ahimelech, which is not the same thing as Ahimelech. So they would enter the beta there instead. So Abimelech, Tony Yere Kai Existe, and so we would just keep going on there. But Abimelech is equal to Ahimelech. Okay, these are the same names. So Abiathar, which in the Greek text in Mark 2 is a very different name than Ahimelech or Abimelech even. And so we have a textual issue. This is a problem that people are pointing out, that Mark is recounting, putting in on the mouth of Jesus, recounting wrong details about the Old Testament text and what's going on there. He got it wrong, is what they're saying. And this is a big blow in skeptics' minds to people who claim inerrancy. because they're like, well, you can't be inerrant if Mark got it wrong. And if he got this wrong, what else did he get wrong is kind of the story. Now, there have been several ways that that people have tried to apologetically answer this. I'm going to give you the top four, okay? The first apologetic answer is what's called the "in those days" answer. And so what this would say is that the apologist who would use this argument would say that the "in those days" or in the days of interpretation, so it says in the days of Abiathar, doesn't mean that Abiathar was necessarily the high priest at the moment, but that it was in those days which he was still alive, and Abiathar, in their minds, was more famous than Ahimelech. And so because of that, Mark chose to use Abiathar's name because it was more understood. And they would be like, oh yeah, in those days. And they would have understood immediately what story he was talking about. So that's the first apologetic way to answer this. There's another way that apologists have tried to kind of make sure that this isn't some kind of glaring contradiction. It's the fame angle, which is a little bit of what I said in the last one. Is that Abiathar is more famous and more recognizable than Ahimelech. And so to say in the days of Abiathar when this happened, it would have been like, oh yeah, we know that guy more than we know Ahimelech, even though the story says Ahimelech. They would have kind of put those two together in the story. The third apologist answer is that this is a scribal error or a gloss that a scribe has put in. And they would say, well, this isn't Mark's mistake in the story. In fact, maybe in the story, it's not even there. But this is maybe a scribal error where they're like, oh, they wrote the wrong name, or they try to correct the name because they're more aware of Abiathar than they are Ahimelech. Or that it was changed at some point. And it was changed in the LXX, and so then it was, it comes back and it's changed to him. There's a problem with that because the Septuagint version of this is not happening, like right there. And so if they're using the Septuagint and understanding the Septuagint, it would have said Ahimelech or Abimelech and not Abiathar. And so maybe a scribe kind of put that in there later or whatever, who knows. Or it wasn't in there in the first place and he puts it in there later. The fourth way that the apologists would try to answer this is to say that there's a historical continuity error. And they would say that the lineage of priests is complicated. It's a complicated one. It could be that these two became conflated over time. Some show that one was the father, one was the son. Like I said earlier, one shows that the other one is the son, the other one's the father. And then maybe at some point these two stories became conflated into one. And so that's how Mark is retelling this story, because all he knows is the conflated story, not the actual, 1 Samuel 21 story. And that's another way people have tried to correct what's going on here. Other answers to this. So if you don't need an inerrant text, if you're someone who's like, well, the point of the story is more important than the historical accuracy of every tiny little piece here and there, then they would just say, listen, Mark got it wrong. Mark got it wrong, and we can be okay to say Mark got it wrong, but the story is what's most important. And here's why I think that is the case. It's because if Mark in priority is a real thing and Matthew and Luke are using Mark, then that's what we would see by people who actually know the story. And so let's look at these stories in the synoptics, okay? Matthew chapter 12, verses 3 and 4, this is where we see this going on. And this is the story in Matthew. This is how Matthew tells it. But he said to them, so it's the same thing, at that time. Let's go back to verse 1. At the time Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, his disciples became hungry, began to pick the heads of grain and eat. Now when the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, look, your disciples are doing what's not lawful to do on the Sabbath. Look what he says here, verse 3. But he said to them, have you not read what David did when he became hungry, he and his companions? How he entered the house of God, and they ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those with him, but for the priests alone. Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple violate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? But I say to you that something greater than the temple is here. But if you had known what this means, I desire compassion rather than sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. So what do we see here? Number one, Matthew utilizes a lot of that story, but he takes out the name. There's no priest in this story. It's as if and some of this is word for word what Mark wrote, and then he takes out Abiathar, because I think Matthew looks at that and goes, that doesn't belong there. That's wrong. Let's take that out. And then to explain a few other things, Matthew adds a few things. Maybe Matthew has more to this story that he wants to add that Mark just didn't have available to him. So let's go over to Luke and see how Luke treats this story, because I think it's even more fascinating. Luke chapter 6 is where we find this same exact story, and it's all in kind of the same sequence too. It says, now it happened that Jesus was passing through some grain fields on a Sabbath, and his disciples were picking the heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands and eating them. But some of the Pharisees said, why are you doing what's not lawful on the Sabbath? And Jesus answering them said, have you not even read what David did when he was hungry, and he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and took and ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for anyone to eat, except the priests alone, and he gave it to his companions. And he was saying to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And then he goes on and does then he kind of does the Mark chapter 1. He goes into the synagogue and heals the man who has the withered hand on another Sabbath, kind of a deal. So Luke also, just like Matthew, doesn't include a high priest here. He doesn't include a name of high priest. And I think what this shows us, and he kind of reduces what Matthew wrote. And I think what this shows us is that Matthew looks at Mark and goes, that's not right. So we'll add in parts of the story that fit, and I'll add in extra things to it. Luke takes out some of the extra stuff, leaves a lot of the Mark and stuff there, but takes out the name of the high priest, because he also knows that doesn't belong. So what is likely from all of the data we have available to us is that Mark gets this wrong. He just gets it wrong. He does not have the right name, and we can try to apologetically work through it, but Matthew and Luke are showing us that dude got it wrong. He didn't have the right priest in there, so we'll just take that out because that doesn't belong there. Because we know the story better. We know 1 Samuel 21. So anyway, I think that's fascinating. It does not. Here's the deal. This is why, some people, skeptics of Christianity, want to say, well, this is a major deal. This is not that major of a deal. Quite literally, it's not that major of a deal. It's major to those who want to say, well, every single word of this has to be inerrant. And so if that's my stance, then I have to apologetically work through all of this. It's not that case if you're like, listen, I take this as the inspired text, but I also see a growing tradition here, and Matthew and Luke showed that it's a growing tradition. They're more than happy to go, hey, that was wrong, that wasn't right, let's correct it. But here's why I think it's not that big of a deal. The point of the story that Mark is trying to bring across here of what Jesus is trying to teach us is the most important part here. The theological is way more important than if they got a name of a priest from a story right or not. The point of the story in the Hebrew Bible and the point of the story from Jesus' vantage point is way more important than that little tiny thing there. So anyway, this is going to set up kind of this back and forth between Jesus and the Pharisees going forward. And here's what we're not going to do. We're not going to look at the Pharisees and somehow say, well, look at how terrible these people are. No, here's what I think about the Pharisees. The Pharisees are doing their best to piously follow the Hebrew Bible. They're doing what they think they know to be right. And they're watching Jesus kind of do things that are different than them. And they're questioning him on it. But in Matthew, Jesus says something fascinating. He says, unless your righteousness is more than those of the Pharisees, you can't enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, he's going to solve that problem by his death and resurrection that makes it possible for anyone, whether your righteousness is above that or not. But he places the Pharisees in high regard. And here's what I think is interesting. We don't see a lot of challenges to the Sadducees. We see a whole lot of challenges to the Pharisees. And it's mostly because we tend to challenge those more that we agree with than those that we disagree with. The people that we are that we would agree with more, we want to make sure they get it right too. And so I think Jesus is challenging the Pharisees. He's like, you're so close, but this is taking you far away from it. Let me challenge you, because I think you could really, you're the leaders of these people, and I want you to get it right, kind of a deal. And I think that's more of what we see Jesus trying to do, his attitude towards them. He's frustrated by them, but I think his frustration comes from, you have the truth right in front of you, and I need you to be this up here, but you continually keep going down here. And so I think he's trying to raise their bar, not trying to, point them out as evil or something, okay? So I think that's what we see really going on, and what we're going to see going forward in the Gospel of Mark. Well, thanks for hanging out with me today. Like, subscribe. Hopefully this was informative for you, and hopefully it's helpful for you. And I'll see you in the next video.